Okay, so here I am for my second one, and Manny's still in the background there sleeping. So it's obviously not bothering him that I'm in here doing this, so I'll just go ahead and tell you that the second one's called Representation, Resistance, and the Logic of Difference, Indigenous Culture as Political Resource in the Settler State by Tate, Lefavre. So, yeah, it's an article, it talks about Indigenous resistance, and it's basically saying that Indigenous resistance is alive, fluid, and full of potential. And Indigenous art encompasses identity, knowing, and contemporary modes of expression. So it sort of uses the example of this remnants of like a chainsaw tree and that gets created or carved into a mass. It explains like that this act of destruction by colonialism's specific irreducible element, which is the desire for the control of land, generates new materials and new possibilities for formulating Indigenous resistance. And that's sort of the theme of this whole article. So each piece is discarded, yet each one has a face story and a wealth that is unable to be destroyed by colonialism. And in fact, this attempt at destruction actually creates more possibility to Indigenous resistance. So the idea of the cultural product action as a form of resistance emerged in this case from a panel meetings. And what they noted was that although Indigenous people are living differently and have these sort of diverse ways of knowing, they also share aspects of Indigenous existence as they're like all living through this dominant Western institutional framework. So this is an article that basically comes from this panel and explores Indigenous cultural production as a form of resistance. So, and it's also about unsettling these sorts of images of representation that empowers settler colonial power and disrupting the framework that sort of misrepresents and miscategorizes Indigenous people and their culture, often placing it in sort of like a past presentation. So settler colonial representation has kind of got this embedded hypocrisy because it wants assimilation in land, basically, but it also wants to disempower aspects of indigeneity because in this way it refuses to allow Indigenous people to access the contemporary institution as a maker, like a contemporary maker. It relies on like these past images of like static sort of images of Indigenous people to continue its dominance. So they're presented in this static, vanishing, unchanging, or like even dehumanizing way. So the article's talking about these ways of presenting Indigenous cultural production by settler states that strategically mobilizes Indigenous cultural production towards hegemonic ends. So what this means is that they mobilize and swallow up the minority voices in the process. So an example of this might be a large corporation that extracts on Indigenous land, sponsoring an artist talk, or buying a work and donating it to a gallery. I think that's what an example would be. But these are ways of presenting culture that it doesn't actually help Indigenous people. It kind of makes that clear that it's not something that changes their lives or has like any positive effect. It doesn't have like their version of truth or history in the museum. It's not a shared knowledge, and it doesn't contribute to the betterment of Indigenous lives. So Indigenous cultural production is something that goes beyond an art critique. It involves like the development of a counter discourse. So this is crucial to contemporary Indigenous self-production and cultural future when you consider the struggle for self-representation in places like the institution. So it's a type of cultural activism suggested, and I agree, that could account for cultural production as a distinct form of cultural politics underpinned by political and artistic agendas. So these are methods that Indigenous people are employing that are directly countering the narrative of representation and identity forced upon them. And representation is formative within Indigenous cultural production. It's not merely an expressive place. So within this article, it basically goes through like a bunch of artists that are generating methods that disrupt those ongoing structures of representation of Indigenous people and culture at times because of colonialism and at times in spite of colonialism. So this is a resistance-based collection of artists that are contributing to the makeup of this article, and I just want to talk about one, that is Jessica Metcalf, because I presented on her in another course as well. So she's really interesting, and she's a really important figure in person of fashion, because she's really evolved in things like accountability, like cultural appropriation, and stereotypes in the fashion world. So she also highlights Indigenous cultural designers that are working with culture in a past and present way, and in a forward way that sort of honors their ancestors while making contemporary fashion. So, but she herself is a very important figure because it's in her work with Indigenous and non-Indigenous designers in the fashion world that maintains and consistently subverts that dominant, oppressive representation of Indigenous people. So, actually, her work specifically has created a platform for many Indigenous designers and has helped to get them the recognition that they deserve. But back to the article. In that, all of these artists subvert the official sort of state discourses in their work, whether it's critiquing other research or papers or museums, or talking about the creation of masks through discarded resources. These are people that are subverting these sort of representation produced by the settler state. So that's the end of that one. And I guess we'll be doing this again next week. So Manny and I would like to say have a good weekend and see you Tuesday.